She thought a snack might fall if she hit the vending machine, but the millionaire CEO who saw her changed her life forever. The lobby of the office building was quiet, with only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional echo of footsteps across the polished floor. The vending machine at the end of the hallway flickered softly, casting a pale glow that reflected on the glass surface. Pressed close against it was a tiny figure, a girl who could not have been more than 5 years old. She had blonde hair that fell loosely around her shoulders, a light yellow dress that looked worn but clean, and bright blue eyes that carried a mixture of determination and sadness. Her small fists tapped against the glass panel of the machine, her forehead nearly touching it as she whispered something to herself. She raised her hand again, gave the machine another little knock, and then leaned her head sideways as if hoping that one of the snacks might tumble free. After a moment she sighed, her lips moving just enough for the words to escape, "Maybe something will fall out by accident." She did not realize anyone was watching, and so her voice carried the honest innocence of a child who was clinging to a fragment of hope. Richard had been passing through the building, his steps purposeful as always, the weight of meetings and phone calls still lingering in his mind. He was a man who belonged to a different world, the world of tailored suits, important decisions, and a company that seemed to breathe only because of his will. His dark brown hair was neatly combed back, his light blue suit sharp against his broad shoulders, and his piercing blue eyes usually missed nothing. Yet when he first noticed the little girl, he almost walked past. It was not unusual to see children around the offices, sometimes employees brought them by. But there was something different here. She wasn't waiting for a parent, wasn't carrying a toy, wasn't humming to herself like children often did. She was hungry. That realization froze him in place. He stood silently for a few moments, watching her small body lean against the glass. Her fingers smudged the surface as she pressed her hand against the image of a chocolate bar, as though she could will it into her palm. He noticed her shoes, scuffed and too small, her knees slightly dusty from sitting on the floor earlier. And most of all, he noticed her eyes when she finally turned her head, startled by the shadow of a tall man standing nearby. They were the clearest blue he had ever seen, and in them he read both fear and an aching kind of bravery. She stared up at him without speaking, waiting to see if he would scold her for what she was doing. Richard crouched down slowly so he wouldn't tower over her. He placed one hand on his knee and tried to soften the edge in his voice that so often made grown men nervous in boardrooms. "Why are you knocking on the machine?" he asked quietly. The girl blinked at him, clearly weighing whether it was safe to answer. She bit her lip, then whispered, "Because, maybe it will drop something. Maybe I'll get lucky." Her voice cracked slightly, and then she lowered her gaze, embarrassed. After a pause, she added in an even smaller voice, "I don't have any money." Those words settled heavy between them. Richard felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of guilt, anger, and sorrow that this small child was forced to confront hunger in such a desperate, innocent way. He thought of the countless boardroom dinners he had attended, the expensive bottles of wine that were left unfinished, the untouched trays of food at corporate events. And here was a child, not asking, not begging, simply trying to coax a machine into giving her something by accident. For a long moment he didn't move, his chest tight with thoughts he could not fully explain even to himself. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, though he noticed immediately that the girl wasn't watching his hand. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the machine as though still hoping it would grant her wish. It was that unwavering hope that unsettled him most. When he fed the money into the slot and pressed a button, the sudden clatter of candy bars dropping into the tray made her jump. Her eyes widened, and she turned to him in shock, as though he had performed some kind of magic. Richard picked up the items and held them out to her, but he noticed she hesitated before taking them. It wasn't the hesitation of shyness, it was the hesitation of someone who wasn't used to receiving kindness without suspicion. Finally, with small trembling hands, she accepted the food, holding it close to her chest as though it were treasure. Richard expected her to open it right away, to eat with the hunger that had been written on her face. But she didn't. She just held it, clutching it tightly as her gaze flicked once more toward the doors of the building, as if she was waiting for someone else. That single detail did not escape him. He studied her carefully, realizing this was only the beginning of a story he had not expected to step into. The girl had spoken only a handful of words, but in her silence he heard far more. Hunger, fear, loneliness, and something else he could not yet name. At that moment Richard understood with absolute certainty that his life had just shifted, though he could not explain why. The sound of the candy bar wrapper crinkling in her small hands was the only noise between them as the silence stretched. Richard remained crouched near her, trying not to seem impatient or overwhelming, but inside he was restless. He couldn't stop his mind from circling around the image of this little girl standing in the middle of a corporate tower's lobby as though she belonged nowhere. He wondered how long she had been there, how many employees had walked past without asking her a thing, how many times she had probably tapped her knuckles against the glass of that vending machine without anyone noticing. The thought unsettled him. He was a man used to control, to numbers that added up, to structures that followed rules, but this was something that did not fit into any of his calculations. The girl slowly unwrapped the bar, but instead of eating it quickly, as he expected, she broke off a piece and held it carefully as though she was rationing it. She placed one square in her mouth and chewed with deliberate slowness, then folded the wrapper back down to hide the rest. Richard found himself frowning. Most children would devour such a gift without a thought, but this one was saving it, protecting it. That simple gesture told him more than she could have said with words. She was not used to abundance. She was not even used to sufficiency. She was used to making small things last because she never knew when the next meal would come. "What's your name?" he asked after a while, his voice softer than it had been in years. The girl looked at him, her blue eyes catching the sterile overhead light. She didn't answer right away, and he realized she was gauging whether she could trust him with even that simple truth. After a moment she whispered, "Lily." The name was fragile on her lips, almost as though she feared he might take it from her if she said it too loud. Richard repeated it under his breath, committing it to memory. Lily. He had signed contracts worth billions, spoken the names of the most powerful men and women in business, but none of those syllables carried the same weight as that single word. "Do you live nearby, Lily?" he asked carefully. She shifted, pulling her knees up closer to her chest, and shook her head. Her hands tightened around the candy as though it were a shield. Richard watched her for a long moment, resisting the urge to press further, but then she surprised him by saying in a small voice, "I don't live anywhere. Sometimes I sleep outside. Sometimes inside if I find a place." Her words were matter-of-fact, not dramatized, and that broke him more than tears could have. This child wasn't exaggerating to gain sympathy. She was stating her reality as plainly as if she had said the sky was blue. Richard felt a knot in his throat. He had grown up with comforts most people could never imagine, and even during the rare times he had felt alone, he had never experienced the raw, gnawing emptiness of having no place to belong. He glanced around the lobby, half expecting someone to rush forward and claim her, but no one came. It was just her and him, two strangers who somehow now shared this fragile moment. He leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair as he considered his next move. He couldn't simply leave her there, not when she had admitted something like that. Yet he also knew he couldn't just scoop her up and decide her fate without understanding the full picture. Still, his instincts were screaming at him to do something, to not let her disappear into the shadows of the city once he turned his back. "Are you waiting for someone?" he finally asked. Lily hesitated, and for the first time he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, though it quickly dimmed. "Sometimes I wait," she said softly. Sometimes I think, maybe someone will come. But they don't. Richard felt the sting of those words in his chest. He realized she wasn't just talking about a single moment. She was talking about her life. She had been waiting for someone, anyone, to notice her, to claim her, to care. And until now, no one had. Richard swallowed hard, looking at this small girl who had appeared in his world so suddenly. He could feel the dangerous weight of a decision forming inside him, one that went far beyond kindness or a fleeting gesture. This wasn't about giving her a snack or a few dollars. This was about stepping into a role that terrified him more than any business risk ever had. He was standing at the edge of something vast, and though he couldn't see where it would lead, he knew walking away was no longer an option. Still crouched beside her, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. No one should ever feel like they have to wait forever. He didn't know if she understood the meaning behind his words, but Lily's eyes lingered on him for a long time, as though she sensed he was different from the others who had passed her by. She didn't smile, but there was the faintest loosening of her shoulders, the tiniest sign that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe someone might stay. The lobby grew quieter as the evening hours dragged on, with fewer people hurrying through the polished marble floors, and Richard found himself still sitting beside Lily, unable to bring himself to leave. He had long ago silenced the part of his brain that urged him to return to his office, check his phone, or follow his schedule. For perhaps the first time in years, his calendar did not matter, his meetings did not matter, the world outside these walls did not matter. All that mattered was the fragile figure of a little girl sitting against the vending machine, her small fingers clutching the remains of the candy bar as though it were a lifeline. He tried to imagine what kind of days and nights she had lived through to bring her to this place. Every so often she would glance toward the revolving doors as if expecting someone, but there was no one who came for her. Richard asked himself whether he had ever truly understood loneliness until now. He had lost friends, business partners, even family ties along the way, but he had always had safety, a home, and the power to change his circumstances. For Lily, her entire existence was rooted in waiting, in surviving moment by moment, in convincing herself that scraps were enough. That realization unsettled him in a way no hostile boardroom confrontation ever had. At last, when she shifted uncomfortably against the cold floor, he broke the silence. He asked her if she wanted something warm to eat, his voice careful, hesitant, almost as though he feared she might vanish if he pressed too hard. For a long moment she said nothing, and he thought she might refuse, but then she whispered that she couldn't pay for it. The way she said it wasn't filled with shame, it was simply factual, like stating the weather outside. Richard's heart ached at that. He reassured her that she wouldn't need to, that he was offering, but she still stared at him with wary eyes, testing whether his kindness was genuine or temporary. Finally, she gave the smallest nod, and Richard rose, holding out his hand to her. She looked at it as though it were something foreign, something dangerous, something she both longed for and feared. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her tiny hand into his. Her skin was colder than it should have been for a child, and he felt an unfamiliar protective instinct surge within him. Together they walked to the small cafe tucked into the corner of the lobby. Employees and a few lingering visitors glanced at them curiously, but Richard ignored their stares. He guided her to a table, pulling out a chair that looked far too large for her slight frame. She perched on the edge of it, uncertain, her eyes darting around as if someone might chase her away. When the waiter approached, Richard ordered without hesitation, a hot bowl of soup, bread, and something sweet. Lily said nothing during the exchange, her gaze fixed on the table, but when the food arrived and the steam rose in front of her, her eyes widened. She picked up the spoon carefully, almost reverently, as though she wasn't sure if she was truly allowed to touch it. The first sip of soup seemed to change her entirely, the tension in her shoulders softening as warmth spread through her body. Richard watched her eat in silence, feeling emotions rise within him that he couldn't quite name. Pride, sorrow, rage at the invisible forces that had left her to fend for herself, all of it mixed together. He realized that in his world of numbers and power, he had never once experienced such raw truth. This was what reality looked like outside the walls of privilege, and it humbled him. Halfway through her meal, Lily looked up at him suddenly, her blue eyes striking against her pale skin, and she asked quietly, "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. He thought of all the times people had asked him for things, partnerships, deals, favors, money. No one had ever asked him that with such honesty, without expectation, without agenda. He searched for the right answer and finally admitted, "Because you shouldn't have to be alone." His voice was low, almost broken. Lily studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then she bent her head again and continued to eat, but he noticed her movements were no longer as guarded. She was still cautious, still fragile, but there was a shift, like a locked door creaking open for the first time in years. Richard leaned back in his chair, realizing he had crossed a threshold without even meaning to. He wasn't just feeding a child. He was becoming entangled in her world, a world that had collided with his by chance but would not easily release him now. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was not a temporary act of charity. He was beginning something that would change both of their lives forever, and the weight of that realization both frightened and exhilarated him. When the night deepened outside the towering glass windows of the lobby cafe, Richard realized hours had passed without him noticing. His phone had vibrated itself silent against the table, and he had ignored every call, every message. Across from him, Lily sat with her chin resting in her small hand, her eyelids heavy but stubbornly refusing to close. She was clearly exhausted, yet she didn't want to let the safety of the moment slip away. Richard studied her with a quiet intensity, understanding that for a child like her, peace was not something permanent, but rather a fragile thing that might vanish at any second if she dared to trust it too much. He asked her where she lived, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Lily hesitated, her spoon tracing invisible shapes in the leftover broth of her bowl. She said softly that she didn't live anywhere, that sometimes she stayed in one place, sometimes in another, but most of the time she was waiting for her mother to return, waiting for promises that never came true. Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest as he listened. He wanted to reach across the table and hold her, but he knew too much too soon might frighten her away. Instead, he told her that no child should have to wait for something as simple as a home. The word sounded strange to his own ears, because he had built empires of glass and steel but never once considered the simple foundation of what home meant to someone with nothing. The cafe staff began closing for the night, and Richard realized he could not simply leave her here. When he suggested she come with him, her face tensed, suspicion flashing in her eyes. She had learned the hard way that trust was dangerous, that adults could be cruel even when they smiled. Richard didn't push, he crouched down to her level and said only that she didn't have to be afraid, that he would make sure she was safe, and that she could decide when to leave. Something in his tone seemed to disarm her. Slowly, she gathered the courage to take his hand again, though her grip trembled. The walk through the darkened parking lot to his car was quiet, broken only by the sound of her small shoes scuffing against the pavement. She stopped once, glancing nervously at the sleek black car waiting under the dim lights, and whispered that she wasn't supposed to go with strangers. Richard knelt beside her again and told her she was right, that she should never go with anyone unless she felt it was truly safe, and then added that she didn't have to decide right away. If she wanted, he would sit with her all night right there until the sun came up. The honesty in his words seemed to ease her fears, and after a long moment of silence, she nodded and allowed him to open the door for her. Inside the car, the warmth of the leather seats seemed to astonish her. She ran her fingers along the stitching as if it were something extraordinary, not just upholstery. Richard saw wonder in her eyes, but also unease, the constant battle between curiosity and mistrust. As the car rolled away from the hotel, she pressed her face against the window, staring out at the blur of lights and traffic, and whispered that the city looked different from up high. He realized she had probably never ridden in a car like his before, and he couldn't decide whether that humbled him or shamed him. When they reached his apartment, a penthouse that stretched across the skyline, Lily hesitated once again at the threshold. The marble floor, the towering windows, the art on the walls, everything felt unreal to her, as though she had stepped into another universe. She whispered that she didn't belong there. Richard knelt once more and told her she belonged wherever she was safe, wherever someone cared about her, and that for tonight at least, this was her place. She moved cautiously through the apartment, her little hands brushing over the smooth surfaces of tables, the edges of bookshelves, the soft fabric of the couch. Every corner seemed to remind her of what she didn't have, but Richard saw the faint spark of awe in her eyes. He offered her food again, though she shook her head, too tired to eat more. He guided her to a guest room, though when she saw the vast bed, she looked almost frightened of it. Richard told her she didn't have to sleep there if she didn't want to, that she could curl up on the couch if it felt safer. She finally agreed to try the bed, sitting stiffly on the edge of it until her body began to relax. As he stood in the doorway, watching her fight against sleep, she asked him suddenly if he was going to send her back. The rawness in her voice broke something inside him. He crossed the room slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, and told her gently that he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he promised she wouldn't be left alone again tonight. That seemed to be enough for her. Her eyes fluttered shut, her breathing slowed, and for the first time, he saw her truly rest. Richard remained there long after she fell asleep, listening to the sound of her steady breaths, feeling a new weight settle over him. It was not the weight of business deals, obligations, or power. It was the weight of responsibility, of connection, of realizing that fate had placed this fragile, broken child in his path for a reason. For once in his life, he did not think about his next move in terms of profit or advantage. He thought only of the promise he had made, and how he would have to keep it. Morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, painting the room in soft golden hues that made the city skyline look almost unreal. Richard had been awake for hours, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee untouched beside him, his thoughts tangled in ways that felt new and unsettling. He had spent most of his adult life controlling everything around him, from stock markets to global deals, but now, in his own home, there was a presence he couldn't measure with numbers or predict with strategy. Down the hall, in a guest room that had never been used before, a child who had once been a stranger was sleeping in a bed that looked far too big for her small frame. He had watched her drift off the night before with an unease he didn't quite understand, and the weight of the quiet promise he had given her clung to him with unexpected intensity. When he finally rose from the couch and walked to the guest room, he hesitated at the door. Lily was still asleep, curled beneath the heavy blanket as if she feared it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Her blonde hair fanned across the pillow, her small hand resting near her cheek, and for the first time he saw not just her fragility but also her strength. She had survived nights without warmth, days without food, and yet here she was, breathing steadily, as though the very act of sleep was an act of courage. He felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years, an ache that was not born of loneliness, but of responsibility, of the desperate need to protect. When she woke, blinking against the sunlight, she looked disoriented at first, as though afraid it had all been a dream. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket, and her eyes darted around the luxurious room before settling on him. For a moment, silence hung between them, fragile and uncertain. Then she whispered, almost apologetically, asking if she was allowed to be here. The simplicity of her question pierced him more deeply than any accusation ever had. He crouched down to meet her gaze and told her with quiet conviction that she was not only allowed, but wanted here. Her expression softened, though doubt still lingered in her eyes, the kind of doubt that no words could erase in a single day. He offered her breakfast, guiding her into the kitchen where a spread of food had already been set out by his staff. Pancakes, fruit, eggs, toast, more than she could possibly imagine finishing. She sat at the table, her little hands folded in her lap, not touching anything at first. It was only after he encouraged her, showing her that it was all for her, that she reached out with careful fingers and picked up a piece of fruit. She ate slowly, with the quiet reverence of someone who wasn't used to abundance, and he realized she was savoring each bite as though it might be the last. He watched her with a strange mixture of admiration and guilt, wondering how many times she had gone to bed hungry while he had thrown away food without a second thought. After breakfast, he tried to talk to her, asking small questions about the things she liked, about the games she played, about what made her laugh. She was hesitant at first, giving him answers so short they felt like whispers, but as time passed, her walls began to crack. She admitted she liked drawing, though she never had proper crayons. She told him she liked stories, especially ones about animals, but she never had books of her own. And then, with a sudden intensity that startled him, she said she liked music, because it was the only thing that made the bad days feel smaller. Richard listened carefully, realizing how little it took to make her happy, and how much she had been denied. When she asked if she could see the city from the balcony, he opened the glass doors and let her step outside. She pressed her small hands against the railing, staring wide-eyed at the sprawling cityscape beneath them. The cars below looked like toys, the people like ants, and she whispered that it felt like standing on top of the world. He watched her in that moment and thought how strange it was that he had stood on that very balcony countless times without ever seeing the world the way she saw it. For him, the city had always been about deals and power, but for her it was simply wonder, endless and breathtaking. Later, when he suggested buying her new clothes or toys, she grew quiet again, shrinking into herself as though unsure if she deserved it. He understood instantly that the gesture, though well-meaning, felt overwhelming to her. She wasn't used to being given anything. Instead of pressing, he told her gently that they could decide together what she needed, and that nothing had to happen all at once. Slowly, she began to relax again, and he realized that the key to helping her was not to smother her with what he thought she needed, but to listen to what she actually wanted. That afternoon, he brought her to his office at home, a large space filled with shelves of books and the quiet hum of computers. He handed her a piece of paper and a set of markers, watching as she began to draw with surprising focus. Her little hands moved carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration, and soon a picture began to emerge, two figures holding hands beneath a sun that shone far too brightly to be real. When she finished, she looked up at him shyly and asked if he liked it. He told her it was beautiful, and for the first time he saw a smile spread across her face that wasn't tinged with sadness or fear. As the day faded into evening, Richard found himself reflecting on the strange transformation already happening within him. The man who had once lived for profit margins and acquisitions was now captivated by the small victories of a child's trust, by the way she had taken his sterile, polished world and filled it with something raw and uncalculated. He knew that her scars ran deeper than anything he could see, that her story was only beginning to unfold, and that helping her would require more than just money or comfort. It would require patience, vulnerability, and a willingness to step into places he had long avoided. That night, as he tucked her into bed again, she looked up at him with wide blue eyes and whispered a question that left him momentarily speechless. She asked if he would still be there in the morning, or if he would leave like everyone else had. He leaned down, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and told her that he wasn't going anywhere. And this time, when she closed her eyes, she didn't clutch the blanket in fear. She simply drifted into sleep, her face soft and peaceful, as though she had finally begun to believe him. The following days passed with a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting for Richard. His life, which had once been dictated by endless meetings, negotiations, and carefully orchestrated schedules, began to bend around the presence of the little girl who had stumbled into his world so unexpectedly. Each morning he found himself pausing outside her room, listening for the sound of her breathing, before quietly opening the door to check if she was still there. The simple relief of seeing her safe, wrapped in blankets, felt heavier than closing the most lucrative deal of his career. Lily, though still hesitant in many ways, had started to soften around him, and every small step of trust she offered felt monumental. Yet he knew the outside world would not remain blind to her existence for long, and that realization stirred unease deep inside him. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Richard had taken her to the park. It was one of those rare afternoons where the city seemed less sharp, the air less burdened with noise, and Lily had laughed softly when pigeons surrounded her in hopes of breadcrumbs. He sat back on a bench, watching her with an intensity he tried to disguise, marveling at how something so simple could seem so extraordinary. But as he leaned forward to call her back, he noticed two people in dark suits standing near the edge of the park, their eyes following him with a curiosity that felt too pointed to be coincidence. He knew them for what they were, journalists, hungry for a story that didn't belong to them. He placed his hand on Lily's shoulder and told her it was time to go, his voice steady though inside his chest there was a tightening pressure he hadn't felt in years. By the time they returned to his penthouse, he had already received a call from his assistant warning him that questions were being raised. Reporters had noticed him with a child, and speculation had begun. Was she his? Was there a scandal? A hidden family? The cruel hunger of the media never changed, and he knew the narrative would not be kind. He looked at Lily, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming to herself as she arranged crayons in a careful row, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. The sight filled him with both protectiveness and fear. She had no idea that the world could be so merciless, and he swore to himself that he would not allow them to tear her apart. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Richard sat across from Lily at the dinner table and tried to mask the tension that threatened to choke him. She had grown used to the comfort of 3 meals a day, though she still approached food with caution, eating slowly, as if expecting it to be taken away at any moment. She looked up at him suddenly and asked if something was wrong, if she had done anything to upset him. The innocence in her tone nearly shattered him. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his, and assured her that she had done nothing wrong. He told her gently that sometimes adults worried about things that had nothing to do with children, but that she was safe. She nodded, though her eyes studied him carefully, as if she could sense that the truth ran deeper than his words. Later that night, after she was asleep, Richard stood at his office window, staring out at the glowing city. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, warnings from publicists, and even veiled threats from business rivals who saw in this situation a weakness they could exploit. The image of Lily in her red dress at the vending machine replayed in his mind, the fragility, the hunger, the strange courage it had taken for her to speak to him at all. He had stumbled into her life by chance, but now he realized she had also stumbled into his at a moment when he needed her more than he could admit. The idea of losing her, of allowing the world to twist this into something ugly, filled him with a dread that was sharper than any professional setback he had ever endured. The next morning, his fears became real when he opened the newspaper. On the front page was a blurred photo of him in the park with Lily. The headline screamed speculation, painting him as a secretive man with a hidden child, hinting at scandal where there was none. His jaw tightened as he read the words, anger coursing through him not for himself but for the little girl who had no defense against such cruelty. When Lily wandered into the room and asked why he looked upset, he quickly folded the paper and set it aside. He told her it was nothing, that sometimes newspapers made mistakes, and that none of it mattered. But deep down he knew it mattered very much, because once the world took notice, it would not let go easily. That afternoon, while she napped, Richard sat with his lawyer, discussing options. He was told in no uncertain terms that if anyone began to investigate Lily's past, questions would surface about who she was, where she came from, and why she was with him. The thought of her being dragged into courtrooms, of being prodded by strangers about her life, made him feel sick. His lawyer suggested distancing himself, protecting his reputation, but Richard cut him off sharply. There was no future in which he abandoned Lily. If the world wanted answers, he would give them, but on his terms, and not at the expense of a child who had already endured too much. That night, he sat by Lily's bedside longer than usual. She stirred in her sleep, whispering fragments of dreams he couldn't fully understand, and he brushed her hair back gently, realizing with painful clarity how much she had already come to mean to him. She wasn't just a responsibility or an obligation. She had become his anchor, pulling him out of a life that had been hollow despite its success. He whispered softly to her, though she couldn't hear, promising that he would protect her from the shadows closing in. It was a promise not born of duty but of love, and it frightened him how natural it felt. By the end of that week, he knew the course of his life had shifted forever. No matter what the newspapers said, no matter what the boardrooms whispered, he was determined to fight for Lily. She was no longer just the little girl he had found by chance. She was family now, though neither of them had spoken the word aloud. And as he sat alone in the dark, listening to the steady sound of her breathing from the other room, he realized that for the first time in years, he had something worth losing, and that was what made him truly afraid. The storm that had been building finally broke in ways Richard had both feared and expected, yet the weight of it still pressed on him harder than he thought possible. The photograph in the newspaper had been enough to spark curiosity, but curiosity had evolved into obsession, and within days reporters were camped near his building, cameras flashing every time he or Lily appeared at the entrance. He tried to shield her by having her use the back exit, but even that quickly became impossible once they discovered every corner of his routine. It seemed as if the world had conspired to dissect his life, and while he was used to scrutiny as a public figure, this time it was not just about him, it was about a child who deserved anonymity, dignity, and peace. Each night, as Lily clung to the stuffed bear he had bought her from a store weeks ago, he lay awake wondering how he could shield her from a world that saw headlines instead of humanity. The board members of his company were no less relentless. They summoned him for meetings in which they questioned his judgment, insinuating that keeping a child under his roof could destabilize their image and scare investors. He listened with his jaw clenched as men who had known him for years spoke about Lily as if she were a liability, a problem to be solved, instead of a small girl who had been alone and hungry when he found her. At one point, one board member bluntly suggested that he return her to wherever she came from, and let the authorities handle it. Richard rose from the table and walked out, his silence sharper than words, but inside him something cold and resolute hardened. He would not let anyone reduce Lily to a mistake. Meanwhile, Lily herself began to notice the whispers. She was no longer oblivious to the strangers with cameras or the way people stared when they walked into a cafe. One evening she asked him directly if she was causing trouble for him, if people were angry because he had her in his house. Her small voice was quiet but steady, and the question cut him to the core. He knelt down beside her, holding her hands in his, and told her she was not trouble, she was not wrong, and she was the best thing that had happened to him in years. Her eyes filled with tears, though she nodded as if she only half believed him. In that moment he realized she was already carrying a burden too heavy for her age, the fear of being unwanted yet again, and that thought terrified him more than any scandal. The breaking point came when a rival executive leaked a distorted story to the press, painting Richard as a man who had hidden a child for years, suggesting lies about her parentage and even hinting at corruption. The story was designed to ruin him both personally and professionally, and for a few days it seemed to be working. Reporters shouted accusations at him in the street, demanding answers about his secret daughter. Lily, hearing the shouts, clung to his arm with wide eyes, and he knew in that instant that staying silent would no longer protect her. He would have to do something drastic, something public, something that would expose him to ridicule but also give Lily the shield she needed. That evening, Richard called his lawyer and instructed him to arrange an immediate legal declaration, one that would make headlines but also set the record straight. He was not Lily's father by blood, but he would become her guardian by choice. He would stand in front of cameras, not to defend himself, but to claim her. His lawyer warned him of the risks, the complications, the scrutiny that would follow such a move, but Richard was already certain. It was not about reputation anymore. It was about giving Lily the one thing she had never truly had, stability. The next day, as flashbulbs exploded and journalists shouted questions, Richard stepped up to a podium with Lily at his side. She was dressed in a pale blue dress that made her look both fragile and strong, and she held his hand tightly as if she were afraid he might let go. He spoke not as a CEO defending a corporation but as a man who had found something he could not ignore. He told the world that he had met Lily by chance, that she had been alone, that he had chosen to take her in, and that he was in the process of making it permanent. He told them that she was not a scandal, not a secret, but a child who deserved safety and love, and that if anyone wanted to challenge that, they would have to go through him first. The silence that followed was not the silence of disinterest but of shock. Some reporters lowered their cameras, some exchanged looks of disbelief, and others scribbled furiously as if trying to capture every word. Lily, not fully understanding the magnitude of what he had just done, leaned closer to him and whispered if she had done something wrong. He bent down and whispered back that she had done everything right, that she had given him a reason to fight. In that moment, something shifted between them, an unspoken bond that transcended the chaos around them. That night, when they returned home, Lily climbed onto his lap without hesitation and rested her head against his chest. She whispered that she was scared of all the people, of the cameras and the noise, but that she felt safe with him. Richard, holding her close, realized that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer just a man protecting a child out of obligation or impulse. He was her guardian in every sense of the word, and no matter what battles lay ahead, he would not let her go. For the first time in years, he felt not just the weight of responsibility but the quiet strength of purpose, and it steadied him for whatever storm was yet to come. The fallout from Richard's declaration was immediate and overwhelming, a tidal wave of media frenzy, corporate backlash, and public fascination that swept through his world like a storm without end. The following morning, headlines blared across newspapers and television screens: CEO adopts orphan girl, corporate titan makes shocking public claim, and from boardroom to fatherhood, Richard hails bold move. Some articles painted him as a hero, a man with a heart bigger than his empire, while others dismissed it as a publicity stunt, a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation amid controversy. But none of those words mattered to Richard as much as the small hand that clutched his sleeve that morning at breakfast, as Lily asked in her careful voice whether she was really going to stay with him forever. He set his coffee cup down, leaned forward, and told her in no uncertain terms that forever was exactly what he meant. The relief in her eyes was the only validation he needed. The corporate world, however, was less forgiving. Board members met in emergency sessions, whispering of lost investors, unstable leadership, and the danger of emotions clouding the mind of a man entrusted with billions. Richard was summoned into a boardroom thick with tension, where gray-haired men and sharp-eyed women spoke in rehearsed tones about responsibility, image, and profit margins. He sat through their speeches, his jaw clenched, his eyes distant, until finally one of them asked outright if he understood the gravity of adopting a child while running an empire. Richard leaned forward and told them that the real gravity was leaving a 6-year-old girl alone in a world that had already abandoned her once, and that if his company could not stand behind a man who chose compassion, then perhaps it was not a company worth leading. His words landed with a finality that shook the room. For days, the chaos escalated. Protesters gathered outside the company headquarters, some holding signs declaring support, others demanding his resignation. Investors threatened to pull out, only to be countered by sudden waves of public admiration from ordinary people who had never before cared about Richard Hale but who now saw him as a symbol of decency in a cutthroat world. The pressure was suffocating, but Richard began to notice something changing in Lily during those days. Where once she hid behind him in crowds, she now held her chin a little higher, her small frame steadied by the knowledge that someone had claimed her, someone had chosen her. One evening, as they sat in the living room with the curtains drawn against the flashing lights outside, she crawled onto his lap and whispered that she never thought anyone would want her. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and he told her softly that she was wanted more than she could ever imagine. The storm did not end quickly. Rumors twisted into uglier shapes, with some tabloids even inventing false stories about Lily's past, questioning where she came from and why Richard had found her. He tried to shield her from it, but children were perceptive, and Lily sensed the weight he carried. What surprised him, though, was the strength she began to show in return. Once, when a reporter shouted something cruel as they walked to the car, Richard moved to cover her ears, but Lily pulled his hand down and told him it was okay, that she knew they were wrong. That night, Richard realized that the girl who had once been fragile and frightened was already learning resilience, not because the world was kind to her, but because she had finally been given a place to belong. The turning point came at a press conference that Richard had not wanted to hold but had been advised was necessary. Standing on the stage, under bright lights and dozens of cameras, he expected the usual barrage of questions. What he did not expect was for Lily to tug on his hand halfway through and whisper that she wanted to say something. He knelt down, uncertain, but her expression was steady, and against his instincts, he let her approach the microphone. In her small but unwavering voice, she told the room that she used to think she didn't matter, that nobody wanted her, but that now she had a home and someone who cared, and that made her the happiest girl in the world. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that sinks deep into bone. Richard's vision blurred with tears he refused to shed in public, and when he lifted her back into his arms, he knew something had shifted not just in the room but in the entire narrative surrounding them. From that day forward, the tone began to change. Articles softened, public opinion leaned in their favor, and while there were still critics, there were also thousands of letters sent to Richard's office, filled with stories from people who had once been abandoned, overlooked, or unloved, thanking him for showing that kindness could exist even in the coldest of industries. The board relented, unable to ignore the wave of goodwill, and Richard's position, once hanging by a thread, steadied once more. Yet to him, the true victory was not in preserving his career but in the quiet nights when Lily fell asleep curled against him, finally without fear that she would wake up alone. Months later, when the adoption was finalized in a quiet courtroom, Lily clung to his arm with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The judge asked her if she wanted Richard to be her father, and she nodded fiercely, her eyes shining. Richard could barely speak as he answered yes, his voice breaking, but the papers were signed, and with that moment, the storm that had threatened to destroy them finally gave way to calm. That evening, as they returned home, Richard found himself standing in the doorway of her new bedroom, watching her tuck the stuffed bear under her blanket with care. She looked up at him and asked if he thought her real mother would be proud. His chest ached, but he nodded and told her he believed she would be more proud than anyone. Then Lily smiled, a small but radiant smile, and whispered that she was glad she had waited by that vending machine because it led her to him. Richard turned off the light and closed the door quietly, his heart full in a way it had never been in all his years of building empires. He realized that for the first time, he had not only saved someone else but had also been saved in return. And in that understanding, he knew that no storm, no scandal, no boardroom could ever take away what mattered most, the family he never knew he needed but would fight to protect for the rest of his life.